All right, the way to understand how the TFL causes internal rotation at the knee, or at the hip, excuse me, is you just have to look at the fibers and how they're attached. And a lot of my thoughts on this, just to put a disclaimer, is that I don't have a kinesics degree. I just have a lot of like real world experience. I have a certification. I'm a Kelly Starrett nerd, and I watch all that stuff, and I just freaking love human movement. So if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, but this is my viewpoint, and maybe it can kind of help you understand kind of where I'm coming from, or how I view anatomy. If you look at the way the TFL attaches to the pelvis, it kind of runs down at an angle because of the the pelvis tips forward. I mean, the pelvis is tipped forward because that's just the way it's built. It's kind of a bowl that's kind of open on the front, and when you do the overhead squat and the knee and the hip begin to flex, the pelvis if the knee adducts, what happens also is the pelvis, the femur bone begins to internally rotate, and the knee doesn't just internally rotate, it's actually the pelvis goes into anterior tilt. So they work in conjunction with one another. So it's not like one happens and the other doesn't. They sort of both happen, or they're both affecting each other at both tension points, whether it be more at the knee or it be more at the hip. And you got to remember that this is all a system, so it's just not the TFL isolated. And even though NASM tries to isolate all these things, and that's kind of how you learn it, that's not how it all works. But for the sake of the test and just the way NASM teaches, it has to isolate it. Otherwise, you won't be able to learn essentially, 4 years of college in a weekend, if you know what I mean. But the TFL attaches to the front of the pelvis on the anterior aspect of the pelvis, and if the knee adducts or you do an asymmetrical weight shift, this is actually pretty good because it's asymmetrical weight shift. So because sometimes when there's a valgus knee and the knees go in, the TFL is of course involved. Everything is involved. Even the chest is involved. Everything's involved. But to be specific to the area in which is moving, instead of being knees adducting, since you're shifting to the left side, that TFL is tight because the pelvis on that side is not the pelvis, or the femur bone is not just internally rotating on that left side I was talking about in a previous video. The pelvis itself is actually going into anterior tilt, and in order for the pelvis to go to anterior tilt on that left side that I previously mentioned on the previous video, obviously the hip flexors have to tight, the lower back has to hyperextend, but the TFL is essentially, I think the reason why, and here's my thoughts on it, they picked the TFL because it's I guess more closely connected and shifting. So since you're shifting to the left or shifting to a particular direction, what's happening is those essentially, because I can't remember what TFL does. I know it causes internal rotation. It basically does everything. It's kind of silly if you think about it. The TFL does medial rotation, abduction, and I want to say some flexion, right? So it does those things, right? And this is how do I remember that? I could be wrong by one of them, but how do I remember that? Because I just think about where the fibers connect and how the body moves. And since it's shifting towards that left side, what's happening is that hip is wanting to abduct, it's flexing, and it's internally rotating. So it's essentially doing all three movements while being more shifted on that left side. So that's the reason why there's medial rotation. If you look at anatomy chart, you check your anatomy text, it will say that it is part of internal rotation. However, again, like I said before, and I'll mention this a few times every time I make these videos about NASM and human movement, is that the whole body works as a system. So it's not isolated to the TFL. It's not isolated to the sartorius or the hip flexor or the psoas or the rectus femoris or the glutes. It's a whole system. It's just that NASM, what it does is it takes sections of the muscle groups and try to isolate them and just tries to figure out, okay, what of these muscles that are dysfunctional, which is the most dysfunctional, or which is the one that will, if you try to fix it, like foam rolling or stretching, and will provide you the best clearance to get rid of the asymmetrical weight shift or the described poor movement pattern. And in this case, excuse me, and in this case, it's what is it? It's abduction, internal rotation, or abduction, flexion, and internal rotation, but it does it with a system of movements because there's an asymmetrical weight shift to one side. And I'm just saying asymmetrical the weight shift to the left because I need a reference point to talk about this, otherwise I'm going to get lost when I have a conversation. I hope that clarifies that. I want to do a written post, but every time I try to do written posts, it's hard for me to write it out, and I always forget. You know, like I'm on my way to work right now. I'm just kind of doing a voice recording video, and I'm going to edit this later, but hope that makes sense. Add to the discussion. This stuff is cool.